In lesson 2, we're going to be focusing on the reflective and refractive material qualities of our ocean shader. And by the end, it'll be flexible enough to where this really will serve as a body of water shader. Whether it's an ocean or a lake, a river, or even a pool, it will be customizable enough for each of those situations. But before I begin adding new nodes here in Blender, I'm going to take a look at some reference images so we can refresh our mind about what the goal is. First, let's start out with this image right here. So this is a good image because it kind of matches the wave displacement structure that we have implemented so far. But it also gives us a clear picture of the refractive and reflective nature. So first, let's look at the refraction. We know that water is clear, allowing light to pass through it and bend and bounce around enough to distort what we see through the material. So here we see a killer whale just breaking the surface of the ocean, and we can see through the water right here to that lower white portion of the animal's skin. And this gives us a clear understanding that the ocean has a color to it. Now, when I was a kid, I remember asking, why was the ocean blue? And really the only response I got was that it reflects the sky. And since the sky is blue, the ocean's blue. I think that that's part of the truth, but I think it's more evident that the ocean and different bodies of water have so much in them, like sediment and different organisms and all kinds of material inside the water itself, that there's a definite color to it. Like here we can see it's a greenish blue color. And there's actually more to this, but I'm going to stop there and go ahead and implement that by itself. And we'll make some more observations a little later. I'll jump back over to Blender. And the simplest form of reflection and refraction together exists in the glass BSDF node. So I'll hit Shift A to add shader glass BSDF right there. And then we'll Shift Control click on this to plug it into our material output. Shift Z in the viewport to enable viewport rendering. And right away we can see not only refractions, the clear nature of our shader, but also the reflections where the highlights from the lights are appearing on the surface. But it's really quite dark, and the first thing that I check is the color of our glass, and it's actually not pure white. So there is a darkness to it, a slight darkness. We're at a value of 0.8, so let's bump that up to 0.1. And something else I need to quickly mention is I'm using Blender 2.71, and this is the first version that has some color management adjustments that have been made by the developers, where in all previous versions of Blender and Cycles, I would jump over to the HSV tab and simply change the value here to whatever I wanted, like 1, for example. And I think that that actually works with the extreme values, meaning 1 is the max and then 0 is the minimum. Let's double check that over here. Yeah, so that's true. But if I wanted to say a value in between like 0.8, and then we go look at the RGB, notice that the values average about 0.6. So this is something that you need to be aware of, especially if you're watching a pre-2.71 Cycles shading videos, because you won't be able to copy the value exactly in just this HSV spot. So at least for now, meaning this video, and depending on where the devs go with it, because I've been in conversation with them, encouraging the former behavior where I can just type in the value and it will translate over to the RGB. In the meantime, I'm going to have to type in that same value in the RGB. So I would type 1, tab 1, tab 1. Or alternatively, we can add an input value node, but this only works for white and black values. And also I don't really want to have a value node for each color slot because I'm going to be using plenty of mix nodes. So anyway, that's a pretty substantial difference with the color swatch that you should be aware of. But back to our refraction implementation, we're at a level of 1 right now, which means the maximum amount of light is being let through our material. And even still, it's quite dark. In fact, anytime I use the glass BSDF or the refraction BSDF, I find that a pure value of white rarely looks 100% correct. I trust that it's physically accurate, but I'm also fairly certain that my lights are at an appropriate strength to the point that if I increase the light, the idea being more light would make the refraction a little brighter. If I increase that value, then I'd start to get hot spots. and the highlights themselves would be a little too strong. And since I've used this same shader totem scene in all my materials, I'm pretty satisfied with the levels of the lights as well as the default sample settings for things like transparency and transmission. Let's see, where are those at? The light paths, not the samples. So instead of changing any of those settings, I'm instead going to opt to change this in the color value. So like I had before, I'll take a value node and we'll plug that into the color and then increase the amount to, let's say, 1.5. Now this starts to look like clear water. Though understand that as soon as I go above a value of 1.5, I've begun to taint the physical accuracy. But in all honesty, if it's between physical accuracy or looking better, I'm going to side with looking better, which I think is the case here. Okay, so this is the basics of our refraction reflection setup. But remember, there's color to the water. As we can see up here, the color is a greenish blue tint. But if I open another image, like this picture of an exotic beach somewhere, up here at the shore, the water is extremely clear, like what we have in our shader. However, as we get deeper and the water gains more depth, the saturation and intensity of the blue color increases. It's a characteristic commonly referred to as absorption. And if I go back to that picture with the whale, where was that? This one right here, the absorption is also apparent because I can only see through the water where it's shallow. The white part of this whale, it's closer to the ocean surface, so the depth of the water is less compared to the water surrounding the whale, which basically has nothing in between the surface of the ocean and the ocean floor. So given the very dark color, obviously we can't see all the way to the ocean floor. So the principle of absorption is when the material is thinner, it's easier for light to pass all the way through. Whereas when the material gets deeper and has more depth, light doesn't travel quite so easily through it, making the color darker and often more saturated. And this isn't actually the first time I've covered absorption. The first time I did it was with the Fundamentals of Cycle Shading course, where we looked at the pancake hobo. Specifically, the maple syrup required the absorption effect. So I encourage you to go watch that video to get the ins and outs of setting up that node network, because it's based on a specific scientific formula. And recently I showed you how to customize your startup file to include that absorption node group. And that's what I'm going to add here. But I saved this file before I made the custom startup file, so I need to append this shader group node from my startup scene. So let me go grab that real quick. Config, startup, node tree. Here we go, absorption. So now that I've appended that, I can hit Shift-A, group, absorption. And since this is a fairly complex idea as well as node network, if I tab in to see it, here we can see the complex scientific formula that's being emulated through multiple math nodes. And hopefully you can understand why I don't want to repeat this information here for the sake of time, as well as clarity to focus on specifically the ocean shader. But to visualize what this shader group node is doing, I'm going to add a shader transparent BSDF, and then we'll plug in our value from the absorption into the color. Shift Control click on this transparent to get this plugged into the shader output. And the first thing I need to adjust is the scale here. Let's increase it to, let's say, 5. And we start to see the material getting a little darker. Let's bump that up to 10. Okay, it's starting to show up where you can see that the thinner areas of our shader totem are more see-through, and then the thicker portions, like this top up here, is darker. So we know that it's working. Let's continue to increase the scale of this absorption group node. Let's bump that up to 50. And yeah, that's working pretty well. I actually think I'm going to go down to 20, maybe even 10. And for additional control over the fall off from see-through to not see-through, I can add a converter color ramp. And now this will allow me to drag up the dark value or drag down the white value, and this increases the contrast of the fall off. So let's see here. I think something like that will work pretty well. And now that I've got a white and black, I can use that as a factor to begin adding in the color that we see in our reference image. So let's add a color mix RGB node. And we'll use the color ramp factor output as the factor for this mix node. And then this value that we added into the glass color will be slot number 2, and then slot number 1 can be the extreme color of the deepest part of our ocean. And that's going to be this dark, somewhat saturated bluish green. So I might as well color pick that from our image over here. And let's see, maybe not quite so dark. Okay, let's try that. And now this mix node can be plugged into the color of our glass BSDF. Let's see what that looks like as the shader output. And yeah, we can see that the thicker parts of our shader, like here at the base, which is arguably the thickest, we can see the green color. And then right here on these little spikes, we see hardly any green. It's pretty much perfectly see-through. So this is pretty good, but I want to adjust so that there's a little bit more green, especially up here around the ball. I'm going to use that thickness to gauge how much green there should be. So let's drag up my black value and then maybe take this color a little bit more saturation. Let's go from 0.4 to 0.5 and then maybe a little toward the blue direction. There we go. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. We're definitely headed in the right direction. But let's take it a step further, because in this image, remember, there's sediment in the ocean. And so the deeper the water, the more sediment that we have to see through. And that makes the refractions a little more unclear. So we need to increase the roughness value based on the depth, just like we did with the color. And since I'm focusing more on the refractions themselves, I think now is a good time to separate the refraction element from the reflection element. Because with the glass BSDF, they're both together and you have no individual control over those properties. So less control is never preferred to more control when it comes to computer graphics. So let's kind of move this out of the way and add a shader refraction BSDF, which, as you can imagine, is purely the refractions. And in theory, we can combine the refraction with the glossy BSDF to combine both characteristics together while maintaining individual control. Let's start with the refraction and plug in our mix color output into the color input of the refraction. And let's plug that into the material output. Right away, you'll start to notice that it's a little bit darker in general, but also it takes a lot longer to render. In fact, when I was exploring this, my render time jumped from about 6 minutes to 75 predicted hours. You know how cycles can predict how long it's going to take. That's probably grossly overestimated, but still, the refraction BSDF by itself is incredibly slow compared to the glass BSDF. So slow that I submitted a bug, and after some conversation between the devs, it seems that it's not a bug as much as it's an optimization that needs to happen in the future. Something to do with when the reflections are included, like with the glass BSDF, the light bounces can be calculated a little more quickly. I don't really know the technical details. So I kind of am faced with a dilemma here, because I definitely want to separate the refractions from the reflections and have that individual control, but the render time is just atrocious. So thanks to Cycles being as flexible as it is, we can kind of cheat the system here. And we're going to do that with an input light path node. So I'm going to toss that up here and then add a shader mix shader node. And the idea of our light path node is I can mix the refraction BSDF with the glossy BSDF. And then with the is camera ray, if I plug that into the factor, then the camera will see whatever is in the bottom socket, while whatever is in the top socket will be calculated in things like shadows, diffuse, glossy, singular, reflection, all these other ones that Cycles has to go through, and that can take a long time to calculate, as we can see here with the refraction BSDF. So let's cheat this by plugging in the refraction BSDF to the bottom socket and the glass BSDF to the top socket. I'll rearrange these nodes so they make a little more visual sense. And right away, you should notice that our shader is much faster. It's rendering about the same speed as it was when it was just the glass BSDF, because it's using that shader to calculate all these types of light paths except the one that the camera sees. Or rather, that's what it's going to do. I haven't even plugged in the light path node. So the is camera ray goes into the factor, and now you'll see it speed up significantly. There we go. And now we can really focus on just what the refractions are doing by themselves. So at this point, with the glass BSDF and the refraction BSDF, the roughness is set to 0. That means perfect clarity. Now, if we bump this up, let's say to 0.2, we'll start to see our refractions get a little bit blurrier. What about 0.5? Perhaps even higher, like 0.7? Yeah, I think 0.7 is a good value. A good value meaning the extreme level of sediment, so to speak, in our ocean shader. So the deeper the material, the more depth to the material, the closer to a roughness value of 0.7 it will get. Now I will copy that 0.7 by hovering over, Control C, and I will Shift Control D to duplicate this mix node with the input connections remaining, but I don't need that value node. Instead, we'll use the same color ramp from the absorption, where the top value, remember since it's green, this is the deeper part of the material. We'll set that to a value of 0.7, and I'll plug that into, remember, each of the RGB slots. And then the color slot number 2 can be pure black all the way to 0, so that the thinner portions of the geometry will be perfectly clear. And I can minimize this and plug it into the roughness of both my glass BSDF and the refraction BSDF. And at this point, it can start to get a little bit hard to know what to look for. But if we take a look at the thinner portions of the geometry, mostly these little spikes on the side, we can see that they're fairly clear in regard to refraction clarity. So I actually think I'll drag down my ease value. Or not the ease value, this upper white flag of my color ramp. Let's drag that down just a bit to make these even more clear. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And then just kind of, if I focus in on the thicker parts of the geometry, we should have less clarity, and the color that we defined in this mix node should shine through a little bit more prominently. Let's take a look up top. Let's see, something about that doesn't look quite right. Perhaps I need to define a specific color ramp for not only the color, but also for the roughness. So let me Shift Control D, that color ramp, and let's use this duplicate as the factor for our roughness mix. And then for the original color ramp, I'm going to drag that flag back up to the top. There we go. Yeah, that's helping out. I think I'm satisfied with that. Okay, so yeah, this is pretty good for the refractions. Now let's implement those reflections. We'll be using a glossy BSDF, as you can imagine, so I'll just use the one that I had previously and add a shader mix node. Plug in our glossy BSDF, and we start to get reflections, but they're very blurry, or at least too blurry for the ocean. So we're going to want that to be quite clear. Let's go to 0.001 for the roughness value. There we go. And it's a little too chromish, so the reflections are too strong. Let's go much further down to like 0.1, maybe even 0.05. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. It's really, at 0.05, it's really just catching the highlights from our direct light sources. So I don't know, somewhere between 0.05 and 0.1. 0.075 perhaps. I'll know better when I do an actual render here in a little bit. But I'm dealing with reflections, so if you've learned anything from me, I hope that you would know that I'm going to implement a yes Fresnel component. I like to think that that's what you guessed. And similar to the absorption node group, I'm going to bypass creating my preferred Fresnel setup, which at this point I've probably showed you maybe 20 times in previous training. But like this absorption, I have included it in the startup file, so I'm going to append that into this file. Append Fresnel. Now add that in with Shift A group Fresnel. Now this is specific to how I implement Fresnel. There are plenty of ways to do it, but if I Shift Control click on this Fresnel group node, we can see that the factor A output has the edges of our geometry, or the surfaces that face more away from the camera. It's a lighter value, and then as the surface of the geometry faces more directly to the camera, it's a darker value. So this is what I like to use for a mix factor or a color value of reflection. So I'm going to plug that into the factor of our mix shader. And then if I Shift Control click on it again, we get factor B, which is kind of the reverse idea, meaning as the camera faces the geometry directly, the color is lighter, and then as the surface faces away from the camera, it's darker. So this works good for a roughness value. With roughness, darker values are more clear and reflective. Lighter values are blurrier reflections. So I can plug in factor B into the roughness of our glossy BSDF, and then Shift Control click on our mix shader just to see what that's giving us. That's not too bad. I think that the roughness at least needs to come down in value in general. And so for the factor B slider here, if I take that down by half, let's go to 0.5. Now our reflections in general have more clarity, though there is still that fall off. So yeah, that looks pretty good. And then take down the factor a little bit, factor A a little bit. Let's try 0.5 as well. Lower values will make the reflections not so strong, as you can imagine. So maybe 0.5 is too far. Let's go to 0.7. Yeah, I think that's going to be good for now. At this point, we have regained the combination of reflection and refraction while maintaining the ability to manipulate each characteristic individually. Let's go ahead and do a render with the full geometry resolution. Okay, I think this is looking pretty good at this point, though I do think the color could use a little more saturation compared to the reference up here, and especially compared to other types of oceans like this one where it's significantly more saturated. So I'm going to want to include that. Let's escape out of this and increase the saturation just a bit. Saturation from 0.5 to, let's say, 0.7, maybe even 0.8. Yeah, I think that looks a little bit better. Also, let's jump back over to my reference images, because I want to take our shader one step further, where here, this has been the main reference that we've been following, and when we use the absorption information to govern the roughness, meaning the deeper the water, the more rough the refractions became, I think that works for this example. But what about this one, where the ocean seems to glow and kind of emanate to a degree? There's a certain translucent quality that we aren't able to achieve by simply increasing the roughness value of the refractions. Not only does this effect occur in, this kind of tropical blue water, but also it's common in things like rivers and lake water, where it's usually very murky and kind of soupy, where you can't see through it so easily. And I want to include this possibility in the shader. So let's jump back over to Blender, and I can do this with a translucent BSDF. Let's go ahead and add that, shader translucent BSDF. I'll get rid of this transparent one. And let's plug in, let's say, the color mix value that we've been using for the glass and the refraction BSDF. And let's just see what that looks like by itself. Okay, so this is another representation of the absorption effect, where the thinner the material, it's very white, and then the deeper or thicker the material, it incorporates that color. I really like the way that the translucent BSDF handles this. It kind of gives that soupy nature to the water, but not by itself. We're going to use the absorption as a factor to mix the translucent into the glass and refraction BSDF that we have here. So let's move all these nodes back just to make a little bit more room for another mix node. And that's going to go before the reflections are added. And we'll take the translucent BSDF, plug it into the upper socket of this new mix shader node. And then our former combination of glass and refraction goes in the bottom socket. And now let's see which color ramp. Let's start with this color ramp to see how well that works as the factor over here. Let's take a look at it by itself. Yeah, we're really starting to get that nice glow effect that we see in images like, let's see, I think it's this one. Yeah, this is kind of what I'm going for. And we can see in the deeper parts how that is starting to shine through. Though, let's see, if we look closer at this spike, we can get a good idea of the fall off where it's very clear to translucent. And I need that fall off to be a little less abrupt. So I'm going to duplicate Shift-Control-D this color ramp up top, and we're going to make a new one. So this will serve as the factor of the translucent combination. Okay, so that should look the same. Let's start dragging down the black flag. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Maybe drag down the white a little bit more. Yeah, that's not too bad. Though, if I think that it's a little too strong, I can simply take the black flag and raise its value from pure black. So let's go up a little bit, you know, to a value of, let's say, 0.2 all the way down. The higher I go, the less of an effect that translucent BSDF will have. But let's see what it looks like combined with reflections, because that's the true test of what our shader will look like in the end. And let's do an actual render of this to compare with the original. Here we are. Let's compare to the previous render where the color is much more desaturated and dark. In the new render, we have that translucent element. As well as saturating the color, we get that little bit of glow. And even though it might not be extremely prominent in this type of ocean shader that we were modeling off of, where is that image? This one right here, we don't have quite as much of the translucence, even though with it, I do think it matches our reference a little bit better. But that translucent attribute is going to be important when we try and create an ocean like this. And that's going to be all for the components of refraction and reflection. In the next lesson, we're going to look at caustics.